In the discussion of evidence, we first start off by saying that it's information that we use as an auditor to determine whether the entity or the data has met some of the established criteria or objectives, and whether or not it supports the conclusions of the audit. In fact, we have to have evidence because I just don't want to go in there and say, here's my report and it says you're fine. I want to be able to supply evidence. Now, the sources of evidence could simply be from the auditor's observations, notes from interviews with management to get their assertions, to interviews with people in the IS departments, information from the correspondence or other documentation that they might have. It could be correspondence with a vendor that supplied you with the control that you're purchasing. And of course, you should have an audit test and the results of that audit test to also use to further the evidence to support your conclusions. Now, we have to make sure that the evidence is reliable. That means we need to show independence of the evidence provider. That might mean the auditor itself. Because if I can be shown that I have a bias, whether it's a bias because I feel the pressure of management, it's going to get rid of my job if I give them a bad report, if it's bias because of illegal activities, briberies, those types of things, then you can't trust the evidence and shouldn't use it to support any conclusions. So we need to show independence of the evidence provider or the auditor. And of course, I also want to know what are the qualifications of the person that is providing the evidence. If I've got a person providing evidence about, a certain vendor firewall, I got to ask, do they know what they're talking about? Have they worked with this vendor before? Do they understand firewall technologies? Or is this a person who more works on Windows operating systems and they understand the ins and outs of Windows, but really, aren't working on the infrastructure support or the security support? Qualifications. Because, the more qualified you are, the more I'm going to believe the evidence. It's kind of like if you've ever watched any courtroom dramas. They talk about bringing the expert witness up there. Because, the evidence from an expert witness, we call them an expert because we believe in their qualifications and we hold that evidence to a higher value than if it was, Ken coming in with whatever story I may have made up. All right, the objectivity of the evidence as well and the timing of the evidence, looking at when was the evidence gathered as a part of the whole testing procedure as well. But those are things that we look at to make sure that we can rely on the evidence to draw our conclusions and our recommendations in our final reports. Now, you can gather evidence from a lot of different locations. I've mentioned some already. It could be just you're doing some reviews of the organizational structure, of policies and procedures, of standards and documentation. In fact, those are all good sources of information and evidence and should be information you've already gathered as a part of understanding the goals of the organization as it's aligned with what you're auditing to make sure that you've got that compliance, that they're integrated together. Personnel interviews, of course, observations of the processes, watching the employees, performing their duties, maybe having them re-perform some of it for you so you can watch their understanding of procedures and what they're doing is in basically be able to compare that to your policies and procedures because that would be evidential. Either they're following the procedures, they're not following procedures, or they're not following procedures, interview them, find out why. Doing walkthroughs, yourself. Can I follow these procedures and walk through and do the performance that's expected of me? These are all good places to get evidence. When we talk about interviewing and observing the people that are watching, these are techniques that help you to identify the actual functions of what people do, the actual processes or procedures. If I have a procedure that says, I'll make it easy. This is how you send an email, right? You open up your email client, you click, you follow those procedures, and you watch the person doing this, and you say, okay, you're not following the procedures that I read. Why is that? And you say, well, those procedures were written 2 years ago. We've had 4 upgrades to the email client, and those buttons don't exist anymore. Those are techniques that help you identify, the information that you need, right? The actual functions, watching how it actually works, watching the processes, the procedures, testing the security awareness, of course, of the people involved, and reporting relationships that are there. All of this is just part of, like I said, gathering information as a good auditor to be able to help get the evidence that you need to be able to do the proper evaluation of the controls. We mentioned the use of sampling, and we talked about it with the risk of auditing. Because as we said, there are possibilities that we can make errors or miss errors when we're doing the auditing. One of them was in the sampling. Now remember, sampling is what we do when it would be too expensive or time consuming for us to go through all transactions of the events being audited, because there may be millions or hundreds of millions. Some of the methods of sampling could be a statistical sampling, which would utilize your mathematical laws of probability. You could use the non-statistical sampling, sometimes called a judgmental sampling, and that's based on the auditor's judgment to determine what method of sampling, how many items they want to look at, and which items they want to select. They might make these decisions because they may be very familiar with the process, and they may understand that certain parts of a process, maybe because of their complexity, are more prone to having issues. And so rather than doing a statistical sample and miss a specific type of event that I want to audit, I might, because of my judgment, say, you know what? I need to audit this particular bit of information because I know that it's tricky. I know that there's problems with it, and I need to, and so that's the judgment call going in to look at what wants to be examined, what items I'm going to select. Another type of sampling is called the variable sampling. And it's a type of sampling that looks up population characteristics that have variance. And these could include items that are monetary values or weights, attributes as an example. One of them, in fact, is the attribute sampling, which is the occurrence or the rate that a certain attribute does exist. So you might want to, look at like a computer access form and look for the attribute of a signature being at the bottom of each one of those authorization forms. And so that's the attribute you're looking at, of the sample that you're looking at, the forms. Stop and go sampling, I use an example of verifying, a new recording file. So you got this file. It's maybe audio, video, and you want to make sure that everything appears to be good, sound quality, and the rest, without actually listening to the entire sample or the entire object. You might start at the beginning, go for a set time, stop, move to another part of the sampling, and the idea is if it sounds good at all of these different locations, then the assumption is that stuff we didn't sample would also be good. And on the discovery sampling, that's where you might be actually looking for a specific object or a specific bit of information, usually in a fraud or irregular activities. So, if I looked at it and I said, well, that guy Ken, he's got some really weird, irregular stuff going on, and I'm not sure, it's kind of different, maybe even fraudulent. So I could say, let's go and take and discover all of the things that Ken was involved in and sample those, right? Very, very specific into the discovery. Now, when it comes to the variable sampling, there are some different types of sampling you can do of a quantitative type. One is the stratified mean per unit, where you can actually break the information down into different groups and look at them individually as groups. The unstratified mean would be to look at the average mean for all of them. And the difference estimation is, of course, knowing what some of the expectations are, what the actual values are, and having, again, those guesses at the differences. Now, variable sampling, we have to remember, we're not looking at all of the information, probably because it's too overwhelming. So we have to have what's called a confidence coefficient, which is a percentage value. If I could look at the entire array of information, my confidence coefficient would be near 100%. But if depending on the type of sampling I'm doing and the information I'm looking at, I can still give you a coefficient. I can put you in the 90%, 95% confidence rating. Then you understand that there is a level of risk that I may have missed something. And so that's, what we're basically trying to say is, here's to the precision that I feel confident, the precision of the information that I've audited. I expect that there are going to be error rates because I didn't look at all of the information. So I have to, first of all, have an error rate that I'm comfortable with. From there, you can have the sample mean, the sample standard deviation, tolerable error rate. So I might have an expected error rate. And as I'm looking through the samples and I'm going, doing my evaluations, my error rate might be higher than I expected, but at some point it's still tolerable. It's within, again, the standard that I have, at least an average. And if my error rate, as I'm doing the sample, becomes higher than I want, higher than it's tolerable, then that means I probably have to change the way in which I'm doing the samples. So again, things to think about as far as what we're trying to provide. And if you really think about it, it almost comes down to a comfort level when it comes to how much I'm willing to risk, the precision, my expected error rates, my tolerable error rates, my confidence coefficient, and that's a part of what we consider as we're doing these variable samplings.